Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Delta EE webinar, where we'll be exploring opportunities for electrification of heat in Europe. So I am Lindsay Sugden. I'm head of heat here at Delta, and I am joined by my colleague, Catherine.
Hi,
Catherine, would you
everyone.
like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So I'm Catherine, and I work with Lindsay in the heat across our 3 heat services, and I'm a heat analyst.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so I'm just going to take you through the agenda of what we're going to cover today. So to begin with, we'll introduce how the webinar works and show you how you can ask questions and so on. Then we're going to take you through our view of the outlook for electrification of heating and hot water in Europe, and explain a bit about the research that we've done here. We'll discuss some highlights of some of the factors that we think make a strong opportunity for electrification of heating and hot water, and discuss what we think the outlook is, and gaze into our crystal ball and think about what things will look like in 2030. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to explain a bit about how the webinar works.
Yeah, so we'll be talking for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you have questions, please do ask them. If you can put them in the question section of the software as opposed to the chat, then we can make sure that we don't miss them. We'll leave most of the questions till the end, but if there are relevant questions as we're going along, we can address them throughout the webinar. And if we don't manage to answer your question during this session, then we'll follow up after the webinar. So hopefully that's all clear. I'm going to just hand over to Lindsay, and Lindsay, if you could introduce a little bit about Delta EE for those who are not familiar with our work.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so I'm sure that many of you will know who Delta are, but for those of you who don't, I can see there's a few names that we don't know in the attendee list. We're a research and consulting business which helps our clients to navigate the transition to new energy and new heat in this case. Our clients are HVAC companies, energy companies predominantly, and also some other types of company, policymakers and influencers. This chart here shows the breadth of our research, and heat here in the center has been the longest running research area we have in Delta. Under heat, we have subscription research on electrification of heat, where this research is drawn from, and also around gas heating and heating business models. And then we do consultancy on the side. So just for a bit of context, if Catherine, if you move on to the next slide. This just identifies the 6 key disruptions in the heating market which we see happening today, and our heat research looks at the evolution of heating markets and decarbonisation of heat in the context of these 6 disruptive factors. So the transition to low carbon and connected technology, tightening policy and regulation around decarbonisation, an evolving competitive environment, new ways for heating products to get to market, and new ways of selling them, new types of customer propositions, and the changing role of the end user or the customer. So I will hand back over to Catherine, and she'll give you just a little bit of background on what we've done in this particular piece of work, and before we share the highlights.
Thanks, Lindsay. So for some context to today's webinar, the information that we're going to share offers a snapshot from some of the findings from our recent piece of research. And this is under the electrification of heat service, as Lindsay mentioned. So during this work, we researched 34 countries across Europe. So the countries listed on the right-hand side here. We examined a range of indicators, including building stock, heating market makeup, demand-side flexibility, policies, to assess the opportunity for the electrification of heating and hot water over the coming decade. We published the results in a report for Delta EE subscribers, and along with a data set to support the data from the report. And we're really pleased to be able to share with you some of those findings from today. So namely, some headlines for you. The outlook for different types of electric technologies through to 2030 are shown on the right-hand side here, and the existing installed base for a benchmark context is shown on the left-hand side here. So we expect the fastest growth to happen in hydronic heat pumps, although the size of the installed base, as you can see on the left-hand side, is lower than other technologies. We do expect the fastest growth. There's a big replacement market for electric hot water heaters due to the large installed base, as you can see on the left, and we're going to talk more about this in the coming slides. Direct electric also has a really significant replacement market, although we do expect this to decline in growth, the growth to decline due to competition from air-to-air heat pumps. Air-to-air heat pumps we expect to grow quite significantly out to 2030, and this is driven by increased demand for cooling, awareness of the heating capabilities of air-to-air heat pumps, and the emergence of more low-cost products on the market. We might also expect to see a greater share of air-to-air heat pumps in new builds. As new build regulations become stricter, the installation of hydronic heat distribution systems are going to become less commercially worthwhile, and opportunities for the likes of air-to-air heat pumps will open up. A slide from the report. Our main view of the main opportunities for the electrification of heating and hot water across Europe. We see opportunities across all markets. There's already a really large share of installed base of electric HVAC solutions across Europe. About 100 million dwellings already have at least one electric HVAC solution, and we expect this to increase. The biggest opportunities are in these dark orange countries, so France, Switzerland, Austria, and the Nordics. And I'm going to pass on to Lindsay to give you a little bit of an explanation around what we mean by stronger opportunities and the factors that play a part in that.
Yeah, thanks, Katrin. So there's many factors influencing the scale and the characteristics of the opportunity for electrification of heating and hot water. And on this slide here, we mention some of the most important characteristics of markets which have strong outlook for electrification of heat. So just to walk you through them, the first point that we mentioned here, that there's a high demand for autonomous hot water systems. So in this segment, electric solutions already dominate at a European level, so this is an important market. The second point that we mentioned here, that there's a large share of homes without hydronic heat distribution systems, so that's water-based heat distribution systems, where there's markets with a large share of these types of heat without water-based heat distribution systems, there is a good opportunity for direct electric solutions and air-to-air solutions, air-to-air heat pumps, for example. The third point is around the fact that there's a high demand for cooling. So air-to-air heat pumps in particular have a competitive advantage over non-electric solutions to meet these cooling needs, and also because they can cool as well as heat. And with cooling demand expected to increase this decade, not only in the southern parts of Europe where it's high today, but also coming further north, this driver will only strengthen. The fourth point then to mention is there's a strong economic proposition for electric solutions. So in many markets, the economic case for electrification is actually weak, especially compared to gas. So this is a challenge. In some markets, it looks better, and we'll highlight that. The fifth point is that there's strong customer engagement. So here we mean both installers and end users. So engagement in electric solutions. This may be because there's a history of electric heating in that market, or because there's been strong promotion by policymakers, industry, etc. The next point is around policy and regulation, which could be at a national or local municipality level, for example, where these policies and regulations are pushing beyond fossil boilers, and in some cases explicitly pushing towards electrification. This is obviously a strong driver and creates a stronger opportunity. And then the final point, which we're going to focus on a bit later in the slides, is the demand side flexibility market. So if this market is open and accessible, including for residential electric heating and hot water assets to provide flexibility, this can be a clear added value for electric propositions. This is a driver which will only become more critical during this decade. So this is also something that we've assessed across the different markets. So for the purpose of this webinar, we're just going to focus on three of these characteristics. So it's the three highlighted in yellow on this slide. So the first one we're going to focus on is this point that I mentioned about high demand for autonomous hot water systems. By autonomous, we mean that the hot water system can work independently from the primary space heating. I'm going to hand over to Katrin to discuss this in a bit more detail and ask Katrin, where do you think the key markets and segments are for electric hot water, and what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because there's already quite a large share of dwellings with autonomous electric hot water heating systems. So around 80 million, that's 25%, a quarter of the total number of dwellings that we were looking at across these European countries. So in terms of key segments, there are a number of segments in which electric hot water heaters can be installed and that we've seen. I'm going to just pull out and focus on three here. So one is markets where there is already a high share of room heating. So for example, direct electric or wood stoves that we've seen in parts of Eastern and Southern Europe, such as Romania, or where there's limited heat demand. So such as in parts of Southern Europe, like Spain. The second is where there's already a market, with already a history of autonomous hot water alongside a fossil boiler. So examples of this are Switzerland, Ireland, and France that we already see currently. And the third is alongside district heating networks. So those that are either for heat only, such as Croatia, or where they're switched off over the summer. In Bulgaria is an example where maintenance takes place. In terms
Thanks,
of,
Katrin. It's maybe just worth mentioning what types of systems we're talking about when we talk about autonomous electric hot water. So the technologies that we're including within this, it could be, for example, electric instantaneous water heaters, electric storage water heaters, domestic hot water heat pumps as well.
yeah.
So sorry to interrupt, Katrin, tell us how you think things are going to change towards 2030.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And this actually comes into this point as well. So overall, I think what we're expecting is the number of dwellings with autonomous electric water heating systems will remain stable. So it could decline in some parts of Southern and Eastern Europe, where economic growth is leading to more dwellings shifting to central heating, hydronic distribution heating systems. But it could increase in markets where there's a trend towards lower temperature space heating, used, for example, in collective heating systems for multifamily homes, or advanced district heating, where you have a decentralized electric hot water system to boost the temperature of these individual flats. And we're already seeing this in markets such as Austria and the Nordics. In terms of the key opportunities that we'll likely see over the coming decade, One is a shift in the types of products, so opportunities to upsell to smarter and more efficient systems, such as domestic hot water heat pumps, replacing electric storage water heaters, as Lindsay was mentioning just then. And then the second interesting trend we think will be hot water increasingly recognised as a good source of energy system flexibility. So more smart electric hot water solutions that are able to capture value from flexibility. We're already seeing it in some markets already, the UK, Ireland, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in some coming slides. So going to pass on to Lindsay to speak about this second characteristic, which is around the decarbonisation of heat policy. Well, firstly, I'll be speaking about this, and then we'll pass over to Lindsay. But specifically, this is in relation to opportunities for electric solutions, mainly heat pumps, presented by new build regulations in selected countries, and also by more restrictions or some restrictions in the retrofit segment as well, albeit it's more of a challenging sector. And then all of that balanced with the threat of ambitions to decarbonise gas, electric being not the only solution to decarbonise heating in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Why don't you tell us some more about the decarbonisation of heat policy research?
Yeah, so this chart that I wanted to share, it provides a snapshot of the impact of firstly new build regulations on gas boiler installations and what this can mean for electric solutions over the coming decade. So in orange, bright orange, new build regulations are more favourable for electric solutions such as heat pumps, so not gas in these markets. It's either because there's a high share of renewables required by new build regulations, or there's an effective ban on gas boilers. For markets then in lighter orange here, gas is still possible, but a minimum share of renewables required makes it challenging for gas to be installed alone. Germany is a really good example of this. The policy approach has typically been more technology agnostic in relation to heat decarbonisation. So it's been open to more of a range of solutions than perhaps other markets. And then finally, those in light blue, these are the markets where there are no restrictions for installing a gas condensing boiler in a new build. So it's not to say that a heating transition isn't taking place. In Greece, for example, there's a transition from oil to gas. In parts of Eastern and Southern Europe, there's a move from non-condensing to condensing boilers, for example, in Croatia. But now coming on to the retrofit market, as I mentioned, this is different. The on-gas retrofit segment represents the most challenging battleground for heat pumps. Customers are generally quite happy with gas. There are fewer regulations, and despite subsidies in many markets, the economics don't stack up for electric heat pumps against gas. But what we are seeing, interestingly, in some Western European countries, is that heat pumps are beginning to make headway. So thanks to a combination of favourable policies and market features combined together. So I'll give you two examples. One is in France, where heat pumps are displacing gas in small numbers in single-family homes, and this is due to a combination of incentives, but combined with the historically favourable spark spread, the gas-electricity price ratio. Second example is the Netherlands, where there's a gas-free target by 2050, where we'll begin to see restrictions for gas installations in retrofit over the coming decade. So those are two examples in retrofit. And as for this outlook through to 2030, how do we expect these policies to change and impact the opportunity for electric? So in new build, the EU's Energy Performance of Buildings Directive requires all new buildings across EU member states to meet nearly zero energy building standards from the start of this year, 2021. So we therefore expect to see growing opportunities for electric solutions as new build regulations become stricter and these start to impact the market. Meanwhile, in retrofit, while heat pumps may well gain some market share against gas boilers in markets with stricter regulations, the challenge with gas will increase in parts of Eastern Europe where gas is on the rise as opposed to declining. And then more broadly, more generally, we expect to see more examples of municipalities, not necessarily national governments, that are driving the phase out of fossil fuels in retrofit. So we're already seeing some examples in some markets. So
yeah, so in places like in parts of the Netherlands,
yeah,
and then Vienna, for example, London, there's a lot of cities and municipalities who are going far beyond the national regulations to try and promote decarbonisation of heat more strongly.
yeah, definitely. And then I think it's important to note that, as I mentioned, decarbonisation of heat isn't just about electrification. So one major uncertainty in this conversation about gas versus electric heating in the future is around the potential to decarbonise gas and ambitions around that. So namely hydrogen and biomethane is what we're talking about. So wanted to highlight here those markets where we see there's a particularly strong activity around decarbonisation of gas. So those in bright orange. We don't expect the decarbonisation of gas to take off significantly before 2030, but following this, post 2030, there is a real possibility, for example, of hydrogen for heat taking off in parts of the UK, Netherlands, Germany, in places where we're starting to see hydrogen for heat pilot projects increase and take off.
Thanks, Catherine. That's a good point regarding the decarbonisation of gas. It's obviously very different from market to market, and the hydrogen for heat market is there's still lots of question marks about that, about what will the costs look like. Will residential heating or heating of buildings be prioritised? We don't think it will be the top priority for the use of hydrogen, but nevertheless, there are quite a large number of hydrogen for heat projects emerging in some markets. So we wouldn't rule it out yet. Probably not going to be at a national level, 100% hydrogen in the gas grid in any market by 2030, but there could well be some hydrogen hubs. So moving on to the final market characteristic which we'd like to focus on today, it's the value from demand side flexibility. So I'm sure many of you on the webinar will already know what we mean here, but just to clarify what we're talking about, demand side flexibility is an increasingly critical element to enable operation of the wider energy system. So increased renewable generation combined with increased penetration of demand side electric assets, including electric heating and hot water, raises the need for electricity grid balancing and managing grid congestion. So electric assets which can enable this demand side flexibility and contribute to, for example, balancing services, can capture new value streams. So if this value from demand side flexibility is accessible through the flexible operation of electric heating and hot water, then this could be a real value add for electric propositions. It should be noted before we go into it that the market for demand side flexibility using residential heating and hot water assets is immature, though there is market activity. There are still barriers to entry. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a bit about which markets in Europe currently offer the best chances to capture this demand side flexibility and which markets are likely to be further ahead towards 2030 in terms of being able to capture value from demand side flexibility. So this map here shows some outputs from our analysis of how markets across Europe compare in terms of their demand side flexibility value potential. So a few markets, including the UK and France, are particularly far ahead. So just to explain why this is, there's three main points that I want to make here. So firstly, the value of flexibility is high or potentially high. So demand side flexibility is more valuable where it's needed the most. So where there is, for example, a high penetration of inflexible generation like wind, which is the case in the UK, in Ireland, in Denmark, and then the demand side assets, there's also a high penetration of those. So for example, electric vehicles, like in Norway, electric heating and hot water, like in France. So the value of flexibility will grow significantly towards 2030 as the penetration of things like wind, electric vehicles, and electric heating and hot water increases. So the markets which score more highly tend to have a higher need for flexibility. The second point is that end users are able to capture value through optimizing operation of their heating and hot water assets. So time of use tariffs are the main way that end users access value from demand side flexibility today. So where operating times of, for example, the heat pump in the home can be optimized to consume electricity most when prices are lowest. And we are seeing today a lot of examples of energy companies and new entrants to the energy space offering time of use tariffs, some of them dynamic time of use tariffs, which are tied to wholesale electricity prices and changing every half an hour. Some of them a bit more simple, but we're seeing more and more examples of these types of tariffs appearing, which are in some cases showing the ability to give reasonable running cost savings or potential for reasonable running cost savings to end users. So the markets which score more highly, there's more activity around time of use tariffs, for example. It makes the value more accessible for end users. The third point is around the fact that industry players can capture value through trading demand side flexibility. So this is more about the fact that technical and regulatory foundations need to be in place to enable the use of demand side flexibility. So particularly in the residential sector, there's obviously often regulations limiting, for example, the aggregation of a lot of small residential loads, and the market is a bit more geared towards larger loads. There's also limits to which different parts of the electricity markets are open. So the UK is one of the most open markets for demand side flexibility, meaning that there are many different types of players can play in the markets, and there's many different value streams accessible. So that's just to explain what we mean there. So across Europe, we're seeing more and more innovation from energy companies, aggregators, heating manufacturers, and other players developing technical solutions and also business models to enable demand side flexibility value. Towards 2030, we expect the need for flexibility and therefore the value of flexibility to be significantly higher. We expect to see some of the barriers to entry for residential demand side flexibility reduce, making it easier to access these values. As we said, the market is still immature today, but certainly from the research we've done, both in this service and also in our sister service, the flexibility research service, it seems clear to us that not engaging in this market is not an option if electrification of heating and hot water is to maximize its potential and capture as much value as possible and create the best propositions. So that was some highlights from three of the main three of the important market characteristics which we wanted to highlight here. If we fast forward to 2030, I don't know if some of you on the webinar have heard some of our Delta E podcast, Talking New Energy, but at the end of that podcast, we always gaze into the Delta EE crystal ball and see what the future holds. So we wanted to have a think about what does the future hold for electrification of heating and hot water. If we imagine now we're in 2030, I'm going to ask Katrin what her top three predictions are for heating and for the electric heating and hot water market in 2030.
I think I'll go for heat pumps displacing gas first. So my prediction is hydronic heat pumps will displace gas in a small number of markets, but only where there's good incentives, innovative business models, and where some of these flexible value streams can be captured. So I think, yeah, there's room for it, but there needs to be good incentives and some of those other things. Next one I'll tackle is flexibility from electric hot water systems. So I think that electric hot water heating will be recognised as the most important solution for flexibility, and that we're going to be seeing lots of real world examples by 2030 of value being captured.
That's an interesting one, because that's a real hot topic, for want of a better word, perhaps. At the moment, there's lots and lots of projects emerging, mainly at the trial or pilot stage, but looking at how to capture flexibility from hot water tanks, for example. There's an interesting project with trying to reduce the amount of wind curtailment by storing the excess wind energy in hot water tanks. There's plans for such a project in Ireland. There's one in the UK for the heat, which is really interesting. And I think there's a recognition that hot water, it's easier to capture flexibility from hot water than it is from potentially just a heat pump on its own. So yeah, I agree with you on that point. Sorry, and you had a third. What's your third?
Yes, third one I'm going to tackle is hydrogen for heat market outlook by 2030. So I predict that a hydrogen for heat market will have taken off in countries with higher levels of hydrogen for heat activity that we're seeing currently. So some of those from the chart I showed earlier, such as Germany, Netherlands, UK, and perhaps the beginnings of an emergence of the market in Eastern Europe, those that are shifting or increasing the shift towards gas currently.
Yeah, actually that's an interesting one, because we got a question about that, Katrin, about how did we decide which markets were strong for decarbonisation of gas? Perhaps that links to that point.
Yeah, so it was a combination of things. It was so one was it had a higher number of hydrogen for heat pilot projects. So that's something that we track in the gas heating service at Delta EE. Second was number of biogas plants to indicate production levels of biomethane, or production levels of biogas, and therefore opportunities for biomethane injection into the grid, biomethane injection into the grid, and then finally goals and ambitions at the national level to decarbonise gas. For example, having a hydrogen strategy and it indicating that hydrogen will be used for heating.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Katrin. Yeah, so to go back to our crystal ball, I think my top three. So firstly, around the value of demand side flexibility. So at the moment, we see fairly minimal value coming back to end users in terms of running cost savings. So it's more like tens of euros, maybe low hundreds of euros per year, if they're lucky at the moment. But I think that could increase to, several hundreds of euros by 2030. Hopefully more than that if real value should come out of it. But I definitely think we're talking about orders of magnitude growth in value. My second point would focus on the air-to-air heat pump market. I think it's already expanded significantly in recent years, and I expect that it will increase even more as cooling demand grows. But one point that we're really interested in tracking very closely is the impact of strengthening building regulations. And as heat demand reduces in new builds, there's already cases that we're seeing in, for example, luxury flats in London, where they're choosing not to install hydronic distribution systems and instead just putting in air-to-air VRF, in this case, systems for space heating. And hydronic, could it be the end of hydronic distribution systems? I don't think it will be the end by 2030, but I think we may see a shift in new build there.
Something, Lindsay, a question for you. Something I'd noted in the research is the potential for air-to-air heat pumps to displace or reduce direct electric, which was something we mentioned earlier. What are your thoughts around that? What's your view on the potential for that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the main reason where air-to-air heat pumps are being installed for heating, sort of kind of primarily for heating, then that's the main types of buildings that they're being installed in, buildings which are currently heated by direct electric. So you can, with a single split air-to-air system, you're just replacing the electric radiators in the kind of main room of the house with an air-to-air heat pump. And it's a quite low cost, fairly simple install in a few hours. So yeah, I think the direct electric market is definitely under threat from air-to-air heat pumps. Also, as we expect more and more low-cost products to emerge on the market, particularly on the kind of eastern fringes of Europe, we see really strong growth in the number of air-to-air heat pumps being sold, which are being imported from China, for example. Yeah, I think they have a kind of a reasonable share of the market in some of those eastern fringes of Europe. So, and in Russia, I think, yeah, I heard some figure that about half of the electric heating products were coming from China. So yeah, I think that's an interesting dynamic to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah. And your final prediction, Lindsay?
Yeah, my final prediction. I think that a combination of dynamic electricity pricing, or at least availability of time of use tariffs, and perhaps some energy price realignment will be improving the economic case for electrification in many markets. So we're already seeing evidence of that happening. In Denmark, the tax on electricity per heat has been reduced almost to zero to try and deal with the price ratio between electricity and gas. I know some ongoing reviews are happening in the Netherlands on that as well, and there's discussions in the UK and Germany. So I think there may well be some more developments there. And if we just look at the speed at which time of use tariffs have become available over the last 2 years, if that continues even at half the rate until 2030, then we're going to see a lot more availability of these tariffs. So the economic proposition may well look better by 2030.
Great.
So we've got time for a few questions. I'm just having a look. So somebody's asked, would it be fair to say that hybrid heat pump, so combination of gas and electricity, gas and electric hybrids, sorry, gas and electric heat pumps are likely to be economically favourable in regions with greater DSF potential, so greater demand side flexibility potential. That's an interesting question. We've done a lot of research on hybrid heat pumps, and I think this is the demand side flexibility potential, the flexibility potential of a hybrid where you can switch between electricity and gas. One of the main reasons that we still see reasonably strong potential for hybrid systems is because of this flexibility value which you can potentially get out of them. I wouldn't necessarily say that every market which looks good for demand side flexibility is going to be good for hybrid heat pumps, but certainly in some markets it looks like it will make more sense. Probably the UK, for example, maybe the Netherlands, so markets that are already quite dominated by gas boilers. But yeah, I'm happy to discuss that point further offline as well. It's a good question. I've got another question here about hydrogen for heat. Do we really believe in hydrogen for heat? So yeah, perhaps Catherine, do you want to just say a few words on, so this question has come from a UK perspective. Do you want to say a few words on why or what you think about it in the UK context?
Yeah, so certainly in the kind of the short term, we see a big in the UK with kind of the target for 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028. There's definitely a near-term push for electric, but there's certainly activity in the UK around and ambitions for hydrogen for heat that could take off from around 2030. I think that the high proportion of homes that are on gas in the UK is a problem. It's a challenge, and hydrogen is certainly being mooted as a way to decarbonise those sectors, which will be difficult. It will be difficult to electrify some of those. So I think it remains to be seen, but from what we're seeing, certainly near-term activity is in the pilot and demonstration phase, and then it could be that in some of these countries with more activity, Germany, Netherlands, UK, for heating, that it will take off.
Yeah, I think then just to reiterate the point that we made earlier, though, it's still open. There's a lot of different parts of the building stock and the energy demand where hydrogen might be required, and certainly hydrogen for heat is not the top priority, I think, in terms of if we've got only a certain amount of hydrogen. If it's limited, then it may well be that it goes all into heavy industry and transport. So I think we're open-minded on it. I think we believe that there will definitely be an increase in electrification of buildings. We also think that hydrogen is going to be an important part of the wider energy system. There's a window now where hydrogen for heat is not a reality now. So we have to use the technologies that are available now. But yeah, we can definitely keep in touch on that one as well.
Yeah, and I think the kind of the way that some of the hydrogen strategies are talking about using the hydrogen is interesting, with heating being considered a secondary option. So in Germany, heating is certainly seen as secondary to the likes of its use in industry and transport. But what we are seeing in Germany is, despite kind of a lower level of ambition at a national level for hydrogen for heat. We're seeing state-led or local actors leading hydrogen for heat projects. So that's quite an interesting development as well, and definitely one to watch.
Yeah, and I can see so there's a follow-up question there, that there's no mention of the safety aspect of hydrogen. I think we can discuss further with our colleagues on the gas heating service on that, but I know that we have done customer research looking at what customers think of, for example, having a hydrogen boiler in their homes, and we expected customers, so end users, to be concerned or have some drawback, have some safety concerns regarding having a hydrogen boiler in their home, but actually they weren't at all, which surprised us. But yeah, in terms of the more kind of technical aspects of that, it would be, yeah, we can get back to you on that. So probably time for one more question. So if we don't get through all of these questions, I can see there's quite a few. We will get back to you by email afterwards. So yeah, so one question here, thinking about cooling demand. Hydronic heat pumps are not really effective in terms of cooling. Here, air-to-air heat pumps have an important advantage. Do we see any trend that people recognise that and prefer air-to-air for heat and cooling, particularly in Central Southern Europe? Yes, I mean, I think when we talk about the market for air-to-air in Southern Europe, it's a well-known technology. Most people have installed it for cooling already, otherwise known as air conditioner. What we're seeing there is that people are more and more recognizing the ability of air-to-air heat pumps to also do heating as a kind of bonus. So I don't think in that part of Europe it's ever really been a debate about whether they should use hydronic heat pumps for cooling or air-to-air, because it's already a market that's more dominated by air-to-air. Where we do see hydronic heat pumps being used for cooling, and it's happening in the northern markets. So for example, in Sweden, ground source heat pumps with passive cooling. So the more with kind of stricter building regulations and increasingly tight buildings, the cooling demand in Northern Europe is increasing. So perhaps where we might see the biggest battle between air-to-air versus hydronic heat pumps, which can do some cooling, I would say that's going to be in the northern parts of Europe rather than Southern Europe. But if you've got further questions on that, then do be in touch with us afterwards. Just in terms of time, when we said we were going to take 45 minutes, and I think we've now taken 49 minutes. So we're going to stop the webinar there. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Thanks to everyone for staying online. And if we haven't had a chance to answer your questions, we'll get back to you later on. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.